Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion. My name is Daniel Forchio, CEO of Represent Justice, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our discussion this afternoon and give a huge thanks to Prudential Financial for their support and partnership of Represent Justice during such a critical time for this work. The movie Just Mercy tells an incredible true story of Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative and his history-making fight for justice for wrongly convicted Walter McMillan in Alabama. The movie touches on themes of innocence, exoneration, and the human costs of a deeply flawed justice system. Our organization, Represent Justice, launched alongside the national release of the film Just Mercy to raise awareness and create a demand for a fair legal system as well as dignity for those who've been impacted by it. Our aim is to bring those people to the forefront of the movement and share their important stories, not just of innocence, but of hope, redemption, and transformation. We've been proud to partner with Prudential in this work. Earlier this year, we co-hosted a screening of Just Mercy for students in Newark, bringing students and teachers from all of Newark's high schools together to watch the movie in the theater. We've worked with high schools, colleges and universities, and law schools across the country to hold screenings and discussion events just like this one, first in theaters and now virtually. To date, we've completed over 480 of those screenings, often including panel discussions and conversations alongside system-impacted advocates. We are in a critical moment for advocacy. The tragic stories of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others this year are part of a system that for too long has produced injustices. Communities are demanding that we reimagine public safety and public health. They are demanding reinvestment instead of incarceration. And so we're excited to continue our work with Prudential this evening, co-hosting a discussion that recognizes those systemic injustices in our legal system and showcases the need for deep investment in community-based programs, particularly for young people. Throughout the conversation today, you can submit audience questions to the Q&A feature for an audience Q&A at the end. And with that, I am so honored to introduce the moderator for today's conversation. Shané Harris is the head of social responsibility and partnerships at Prudential Financial and president of the Prudential Foundation. In her role at Prudential, Shané oversees the company's cash giving and skills-based volunteering programs, including development of program strategy and oversight of over $62 million in grants and charitable contributions. Before joining Prudential in 2004, Shané was the director of the New Jersey Nets and Devils Foundation, and Shané also serves as chairman of the Newark Trust for Education and co-chairs a racial equity narrative change working group, a national initiative of living cities. Please join me in welcoming Shané Harris. Welcome, Shané.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Hello and welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Shané Harris, and I'm so happy to be here with you this evening. I don't have to tell this group that we are living through unusual and turbulent times right now, and that's why I'm glad that we have moments like this to come together as a community. I'm proud to represent Prudential today as a sponsor and moderator of this very important discussion, a long overdue dialogue on how racial inequity and social injustice persists in every aspect of society, and particularly the role that mass incarceration has played in driving racial inequity. I hope you enjoyed the film Just Mercy, whether it was your first time or 10th time viewing it. And that's why I'm excited to be here speaking with this esteemed panel. Joining us today is the Honorable Ras J. Baraka, Mayor of the City of Newark, a Newark native and a member of a prominent Newark family. Since taking office in 2014, Mayor Baraka's leadership has won him accolades from grassroots organizations to the White House. And over the last 6 years, his agenda has focused on ensuring that economic revitalization in cities occur in a way that benefits all inclusively. Mayor Baraka has led a number of strategies and initiatives focused on driving inclusive economic growth in the city of Newark. But one key accomplishment that is relevant to our discussion today is the approach the city has used to address policing and public safety. Under his administration, crime in the city has reduced to its lowest levels in 50 years. Ryan Haygood is a leading civil rights lawyer and the president and CEO of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. He leads the Institute's cutting-edge work in empowering urban communities with employment, housing, and fair treatment by the criminal justice system. Prior to leading the Institute, Ryan served as the Deputy Director of Litigation at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he litigated some of the most important civil rights cases of our time. And lastly, Aqueela Sherrills. Aqueela is the director of the Newark Community Street Team, Mayor Baraka's community-based public safety initiative. Aqueela grew up in Watts, Los Angeles, where he was a member of the Grape Street Crips. At age 19, he co-founded the Amera I Can program with Cleveland Browns star Jim Brown, and he subsequently facilitated a historic peace agreement between the Crips and the Bloods in Los Angeles. Aqueela's work in this area is personal to him and born out of personal tragedy. In 2004, his son, his 18-year-old son, Terrell, was home on a winter break from college where he was tragically killed by another teenager at a party. Determined not to let his son's death be in vain, Aqueela started the Reverence Project and co-founded Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice. And lastly, before we start, I would just like to say just that I am proud that all of these panelists are partners of Prudential, and we are honored to work alongside them in Newark. And just want to also say it's so nice to see you virtually. I miss you guys. So welcome, and let's get started. And we'll start with Mayor Baraka. Mayor Baraka, just mercy shines a deep light on deeply rooted and urgent inequalities in our criminal justice system. Can you tell us what you're hearing from the protests that have taken place in Newark, including the many young people who have participated in the protest, and how Newark as a city is responding to the calls for more equitable systems? Uh-oh, Mayor Baraka, I think you're on mute.
I am. Thank you for having me on here. I appreciate it, and on this panel. And thank you. Good to see you, Shané. I haven't seen you in a minute. It is good to be on this panel here. As the rest of the protests happening around the country, I think the calls are basically similar, right? The folks don't want to be shot down in the street for selling loose cigarettes or choked to death. They don't want cops' knees on their neck, taking the air from them. They don't want their children mistaken as adults and arrested, beaten, and shot. And so what people are asking for basically is for fair treatment, for equal justice, to be treated as human beings. They're also asking not to have to fund, fuel, or pay for a system that has been organized and designed for their own humiliation and denigration. They feel like the cities and municipalities need to begin to use some of those resources for other things that are more proactive and deal with the root causes of problems of violence and crime in their community. And they don't have to pay for officers who come into their neighborhood who violate their constitutional rights. It's really a logical kind of argument that people are making. We're trying to make it have a pragmatic response to it in the city where we can do some of those specific things, but at the same time maintain safety in the short term. These are long-term kind of goals and outcomes that we need, but in the short term, we have to do something about what's happening now, which is why community street team is important and all. And treating violence as a public health issue is important. Newark is also calling for a civilian complaint review board. We stood one up. It was shot down by the Supreme Court, not completely, just some of it. We're now supporting Assemblywoman Knight's legislation that actually mirrors our civilian complaint review board, and she's added a few things herself. We're supporting that on a state level, and to urge our viewers and listeners to do the same, to urge their assembly folks and state legislators to support this bill. We need it to pass here in the city. Besides that and the consent decree and all of the things that we're doing in the city of Newark to address the kind of inequity and abuse that takes place in our system every day, that's a whole panel on its own of what Newark is trying to do around those things, whether it's the training of police officers, the retraining, the use of force policy in Newark has changed. It was changed before the state started talking about it, before George Floyd. Use of force policy was changed. LGBTQ policy, different in the city of Newark. De-escalation training added to what we do in the city of Newark. All of those things have been changed because of the consent decree and because we are retraining the people in our department. We have made our department predominantly Black and brown now to mirror the city that it in fact is in. We've done that. We've promoted more of those folks to higher positions in the police department. Clearly, we believe that people who have an attachment and relationship to the community will prayerfully treat the community better, right? And invest in the communities where they come from, and invest in the people in these communities. So we've clearly tried to do that. That's not to say that things don't happen in our city. What it does say, however, is when things happen, we respond to it, we deal with it. We try to make sure that justice is done swiftly, as swiftly as we can make it happen, because we know that's what people are asking for. They're asking for people to be treated the same. When they commit a crime, that justice is expected to be meted upon them. They want the same kind of justice to be served on officers of the law who are sworn to uphold them, who violate that actual oath and violate their constitutional rights. So.
Thank you, Mayor Baraka. Let's bring Ryan into this conversation now. And I think, what you touched on, Mayor Baraka, is some of the advancements of the work that is taking place in the city and the state of New Jersey. I would love for Ryan to expand on that, because I think we know that just mercy takes place in Alabama. But I think many times there's a fallacy in thinking that these problems only exist in the South. So Ryan, could you touch on, this idea that these systemic issues are bigger than just one state and one region? Mm-hmm. And how do the stories that we see in the film connect to experiences that are taking place now in the state of New Jersey?
Sure. So thanks, Shané, for the chance to join the conversation and for this discussion about what I think is obviously a very timely topic. And, I think one of the big takeaways from Just Mercy is you leave the film very heavy-hearted, and you feel really especially heavy-hearted about Alabama. And I think the theme for Just Mercy is that Just Mercy is not, it's just not out there. It's just not in Alabama. To your point, Shané, it's not just in the southern states. In fact, Just Mercy is right here in New Jersey. And I think this moment, perhaps more than any other recent moment, underscores the significance of the outsized role that the criminal justice system plays. And to the mayor's point, part of that function is because we invest so deeply in it. So just a quick word about New Jersey's own history. New Jersey has 3 youth prisons. The oldest and largest is the Jamesburg prison for boys. Jamesburg was opened 2 years after the end of the Civil War. So Civil War is fought from 1861 to 1865. New Jersey played a pretty significant role in helping southern states to undermine the Civil War. Like, we're often think of in New Jersey as sort of a beacon for democracy, but we're a state where slavery took root very, very deeply. We were the first northern state to restrict voting to white men. We were the last northern state to end slavery. We rejected the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. And so slavery is part of New Jersey's story. So the Civil War ends in 1865, and just 2 years later, New Jersey opens a Jamesburg prison for boys. And at that time, it was populated primarily by newly freed Black youth and immigrants. And what's fascinating now is 152 years later, in New Jersey, a state of 9 million people, there are only 8 white kids in prison. 8. And obviously, we're not advocating for deeper incarceration of white kids, right? But what we are saying is there's a recognition that that low number, what it doesn't reflect is actual participation in delinquent behavior on the part of young white kids, right? What it reflects is a very different response when white kids do things that unfortunately young people often do, right? Sometimes run afoul of the law. And so Jamesburg has a history, a deeply rooted history that followed slavery. And the racial disparities we see today show us that today in New Jersey, a Black kid is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white kid. The highest racial disparity in the country, even though Black and white kids commit offenses at about the same rate. And the yield is very low, so that about 70% of young people, when they leave one of our 3 youth prisons, will re-offend or return to a youth prison within 3 years. So we've got these staggering racial disparities, the yield is very low, and the final piece is on the investment side. You know, we spend, as a state, $300,000 to incarcerate each young person each year. And particularly now, as we're in the throes of the coronavirus pandemic, and as, for example, kids are having to learn at home, we think about, you know, what could you do in the life of a young person were you to invest $300,000 each year in their education, right, on the front end, to empower them, not to incarcerate them. And so, you know, those are the real challenges in New Jersey. I'll close by saying, though, that we're also, I think, at an important point of opportunity. 2 years ago, we and a number of partners, the mayor was very supportive, the Newark Community Street Team joined us with a busload of folks, the Newark Boys Chorus School joined us to sing My Brother's Keeper Newark. There were busloads of folks who joined us on a trip to Jamesburg, where we launched a campaign called 150 Years is Enough. And the campaign was focused on urging the closure of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons because they're each about 1/3 full. The reason it's so expensive each year is because they're staffed as if they're at capacity. So the prisons are 1/3 full, but they're staffed as if they're at capacity. So it's very expensive to do youth incarceration the way we do it. And so this campaign was designed to urge the closure of youth prisons, a reinvestment of those resources into communities most impacted by youth incarceration. And then for those young people for whom public safety issues are real, for whom they need to be out of the community for a while, imagining where you could send them in a way that would help to rehabilitate them, non-prison-like structures. And there's lots of good models. And so the good news is that 2 years ago, we got a really historic announcement that 2 of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons would close. And now comes the hard work, which we're doing along with the mayor and Aqueela and a number of other partners to really reimagine how you make deep investments on the front end in kids. And for those kids entangled in the criminal justice system, how do you restore them so they come back to their communities whole?
Thank you, Ryan. And I think a big theme of what you said is, you know, how do we reimagine appropriate solutions to these challenges that don't create disadvantage? And, you know, I want to bring Aqueela now into the conversation because in many ways, the work of the Newark Community Street Team is kind of represents a different approach, right, to a challenge that most cities face. So we're at a critical inflection point in this country, and many cities and countries and counties are having important and difficult conversations as a result of the national protests, which essentially focus on how to protect public safety and reduce violence. So Aqueela, can you tell us about the work of the Newark Community Street Team, how it began, and how you're leading in this moment in response to the national conversation?
Yes, thank you so much, Shané. Yeah, it's, you know, interestingly, you know, you shared the story of my son, Terrell, being murdered in 2004. And I've known the mayor for close to 25 years, and a lot of folks don't know that in 2004, the mayor was instrumental in organizing a peace treaty in the city of Newark. And so in 2014, the mayor tapped me to come to the city to build out his community-based public safety initiative, the Newark Community Street Team. NCST, works through the frame that violence is a public health issue. We grew out of the mayor commissioned the Safer Newark Council to coordinate the city's public safety strategies in the city, which was essentially funded by Prudential, right? So NCST essentially trains, hires, and deploys residents in the community as public safety professionals to intervene in individual and group conflicts with the idea of bringing those things to a peaceful resolve. One of the things that we did early on with the Safer Newark Council, we worked with Rutgers, who did a study, and we basically discovered that in 2015, that 62% of the homicides that happened in the city started out as personal disputes. So our belief is that if we train residents in conflict resolution and mediation and de-escalation strategies and trauma-informed approaches, and we stand in the gap and we meet residents where they are, that we could prevent some of these violent incidents from happening. And so that's what we did. We launched a safe passage program in the city because we also learned through the health department that most of the violence was happening in and around our schools. Things happen on the school campus during the week and spill into the neighborhood on the weekend and vice versa. And so our outreach workers, who are credible messengers, 100% of our staff are residents of the neighborhoods in which they serve. They show up as a deterrent, making sure that our kids go to school safely, that they come home safely, and that they're then able to connect with resources and services, to help them to mediate conflicts to a peaceful outcome. I would say that the center of our strategy has been our victim services, piece, right? The thing is that if we help to better serve victims, then we prevent them from actually becoming perpetrators. So launching the city's hospital-based violence intervention program has been critical because folks go to the hospital, they get patched up. However, it's important that a safety plan is actually developed so that when individuals are coming back home, that we know that those situations have been resolved. I think that, in this time, it's important to know that law enforcement can no longer be a single point of contact for safety in our neighborhoods, right? Traditionally, we say police, and you say public safety, and people say police. When we know that law enforcement is only one aspect of the public safety process. It's important that we build out complementary strategies to law enforcement to be able to respond to violence in the neighborhood, utilizing a coordinated strategy, because safety is a shared approach. It's not just one entity working on its own to solve all of our problems. We got to have the health department. We have to have schools. We have to have community-based organizations all working together in partnership with law enforcement in order to reduce violence and crime in our cities. And I think that, the mayor has been visionary in terms of his work around this. And, as a direct result of it, we've seen, as you said earlier, Newark has had 4 consecutive years in a row of decreases of homicide. In the South Ward, where NCST targeted its strategy, in 2019, we had a negative 48% reductions in homicides in the community. I mean, this has been unprecedented. And it's because that we have a wonderful working relationship with our law enforcement in the community, because we all understand that it takes the collective to be able to improve public safety as opposed to this single point of safety approach that has been deployed historically.
Thank you, Aqueela. You brought me back when you talked about the origins of the street team work, and I remember, and Mayor Baraka, it must have been weeks into your administration that we collectively convened a retreat, a 2-day retreat, brought everyone to a retreat center and had law enforcement, community partners, civic leaders, business leaders, member of the clergy. And what struck me about that meeting was two things. One, I think, that was the first time I heard you really communicate, Mayor Baraka, your philosophy that violence prevention should be treated as a public health issue. And in many ways, that has served as a cornerstone of the work that we collaborate on. But we also saw a fragmented kind of response in Newark at that time when we had all those sticky notes of everything that, multiple stakeholders were doing. And I think what it led to was, how do you create that multiple stakeholder engagement to really look at a collective action approach to solutions? So Mayor Baraka, Aqueela talked about the journey where we are now and the success we're achieving. I would love to hear kind of your thoughts and insights on how this vision will expand and what, kind of the narrative in Newark would look like in terms of community police relations and the outcomes that we're seeking, here in the city in the future.
Right. So I think that I want to thank Aqueela for laying it out like that, but it's very clear. I mean, one, I think the first thing we tried to do was coordinated intervention. Well, first we had to change the narrative to violence as public health. Because once you have a different narrative, you have a different discussion about what actually is causing this problem, then the prescription for that problem becomes different. And so once we look at the problem differently, we prescribe a different antidote, a different response. And so the response is, if it's a public health response, then it already begs the question: why aren't the health department folks involved? Why aren't other community folks involved? Why aren't social workers involved? Why are other people who deal with public health issues and strategies? Why the Board of Education is not involved? Why all these other entities are not involved? Why is it just law enforcement if it's a public health strategy? And the public health strategy also puts the onus on the society and community as a whole, and not just on individual behavior, and make it about people's like genetics, or we can't fix this problem because it's always going to be this way. It really centers the problem around the kind of issues that take place in our community. And so that was important. And then coordinated intervention is bringing all of those folks together and figure out how do we intervene in a coordinated way. And I think that was what you see is what's happening. And then I think it elevated to trauma-informed care. And people began to understand that once we studied these things, once the Safe and Newark Council pointed out, look, 80% of the city does not experience violent crime in a year, right? So that means, so people were yelling, yeah, that's great. But it also meant that 20% of the city was experiencing about 100% of the violent crime. And if you lived in those areas, it was like living in hell for you, right? And so we had to figure out how to get into those communities and begin to deal with the trauma. And we learned data like people who were born in households that where where folks were arrested would like to be arrested themselves, and people who were victims of violence, their peers, and their siblings and their family members would like to be victims of violence themselves. We also learned that most people who commit violence have been arrested more than 6 or 7 times before they even graduate to violence. And one of the early crimes that they begin is robbery, which is a property crime that deals with them trying to get money and access to things like that. And we begin to try to figure out how to deal with that. We also learned what Aqueela said is that over 60% of the homicides in the city were based on personal disputes. And so we just formulated a strategy around those things that we said. And then here we are today, we've graduated to an Office of Violence Prevention, where before we were trying to steadily figure out ways to divert money from city government into these programs. Now we have a solid strategy, and honestly and transparently based on the push from the George Floyd murder on TV and the protests and cities burning, that it gave us the pathway to be able to do the things in an expeditious way to create this violence office. And the Office of Violence Prevention is not, see, around the country, they're creating a narrative for it already. They're saying that when we make calls, social workers are going to respond to calls. But that's such a small and an inconsequential part of what this is about, right? This is not about somebody calling the police and you send a social worker there. That's not what the Office of Violence Prevention is about. It is about coordinated strategy to reduce trauma, to deal with trauma, to have people respond to trauma, to reduce retaliation from violence, to stop people from entering into violence from the very beginning. And that's what it's designed to do. It's designed because we over-police our communities because of violence. That's why. Our grandmothers, our mothers, my mother specifically said she wished a cop was there when somebody was killing my sister. And that's what people feel in our community on that side. It's the violence that drives the necessity to have this kind of over-policed strategy. Our job is to reduce the level of violence, which reduces the need for over-policing in those communities. And when you reduce the need to over-police those communities, you create more resources that do not have to go into police, that can be reverted or transferred into other parts of the city, particularly into the kind of work that Aqueela is doing, that Keisha Yuri is doing, that the folks all over the city are working on these community-based initiatives. And that's what we're gonna fund those, expand them, allow the safe passageway to happen all over the city, right? To allow the violence interrupters and to be all over the city, not just one part of it. We don't just need them in the South Ward. We need them in the West Ward, in the Central Ward, in the North Ward. We need them everywhere. And so this allows us to expand and not just rely on philanthropic dollars or which way the wind is blowing. It allows us to stabilize it here in the city by funding it consistently with city taxpayer dollars. And I honestly think the residents would prefer that and watch crime be reduced as opposed to having these violent incidents with police. And I just want to say one last thing. The proof of the pudding is in 2013, the city had about 115 or 116 homicides in 2013, right? In 2019, we had 51. So in 2013, we actually made more arrests in the city of Newark than we made in 2019, which proves that there's no real causal relationship between the reduction of violence and arresting people, right? And so that means that there's some other things that are happening here that we have to begin to identify and duplicate and expand so that we can have an even greater impact on what's happening in the city. 51 is still a high number, it's too high, but it's certainly not 115.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And just so glad that the work is thriving and continuing. So switching gears a bit, this is a question for the entire panel, and it has to do with the election, the upcoming election. So we're a little more than 30 days away from the presidential election. And we know that whatever the outcome, it's going to require sustained voting engagement just to achieve the outcomes that we're looking for. The power of legislation to direct community investment highlights the importance of voting beyond the presidential election and of the visionary leadership of elected officials at the state and municipal levels, like Mayor Baraka. However, many people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated have lost their right to vote, while others are cynical that it will lead to real change within their community. Can you all update us on the stage of voting rights in New Jersey as we head towards election day in November, and why it's important for communities to turn out and vote? So we'll start with Ryan and then have Mayor Baraka jump in and Aqueela. But why is this moment so critically important, even in a blue state like New Jersey?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There's no doubt that we are experiencing one of the more difficult national moments of our generation, I think. And yet, as painful as the moment is nationally, we know, right, as students of history, that when change has happened, it's always happened from the ground up in our communities. And so that is especially true here in New Jersey. In the last 2 years, we have seen incredible strides made in the democracy expansion space. So we work together to champion things like automatic voter registration. When you interact with a motor vehicle agency, You're automatically registered to vote unless you opt out. We worked together to restore the right to vote to 83,000 people on probation and parole. That was part of a broader effort called 1844 No More. It was a campaign that recognized that in 1844, New Jersey restricted voting to white men. It also then restricted the right to vote to people with criminal convictions. And because New Jersey connects its voting to its criminal justice system, which has the worst racial disparities in the country, you literally import those racial disparities into the political process. So this 83,000 people restored the right to vote who are on probation or parole, significant. That's a population about the size of our capital city of Trenton. And then earlier this month, we successfully championed online voter registration. And so in the last month, more than 200,000 people have registered to vote online. I mean, significant registration numbers. That's a critical way to enfranchise our brothers and sisters on parole and probation. And I think this is all significant because there is an active effort nationally and in some states to suppress voting rights. And here we have robust access to the franchise. And I think in a democracy, there are very few ways to get power. The chief way, in my mind, is to organize and to vote, and then to hold your elected officials accountable. So tonight is a big debate on the national scene. To be sure, we should be thinking about that and using that as motivation. I'll put in the chat the link to register online. I encourage folks to send that to 10 friends and encourage them to send it to 10 friends. Very easy to register online. And then in New Jersey, there are 5, this is an all paper ballot election. There are 5 ways to cast your ballot. If you use the mail, I encourage you to vote shortly after you get your ballot in the mail. You can track your ballot after if you vote by mail. You can also vote in a secure drop box. You can also vote in person. So there are 5 ways you can cast your paper ballot, but you have to begin to develop a plan right now. And then however you vote your ballot, make sure that you track the status of your ballot.
Thank you, Ryan. Aqueela, and then we'll end with Mayor Baraka. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure. Just from the perspective of civic education, you know, in this country, civics has been pulled out of the schools, and very few people know how the civic process actually works. And so some of the work that we've been doing on the ground is, you know, the city of Newark recently funded the Community-Based Violence Reduction Initiative for NCST. And one of the things that we're hosting is these classes called Community Sentinels classes, right? And it's about teaching civic education and public safety policy so that we can start engaging more folks on the ground who are disconnected from the political process in some of these dialogues and conversations. Bi-monthly, we host a public safety roundtable. That's essentially about civic education and public safety, information, so that we can begin to get folks to kind of work that muscle that we haven't exercised in the past. Very rarely do we get together collectively and go up to Trenton and advocate for different bills, right? So we're pulling some folks from the community who just haven't done this work before. On October the 6th, the Newark Community Street Team and our local Crime Survivor for Safety and Justice chapter is partnering with the Alliance for Safety and Justice for a national campaign that we're doing called Heal the Vote. And it's to get 1,000 survivors in the city of Newark to come out and vote, because it is extremely important that we participate in the voting process. And so it's about really getting people active to participate, which is just important.
Thank you. Mayor Baraka, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just want to echo these guys' sentiment, but also say because of Institute for Social Justice, Ryan Haygood, all of the other advocates in New Jersey, people on parole and probation can actually vote in this election coming up in November. That is important. It's probably the only time in the history of this state that this is possible, and people need to take advantage of that immediately. And I try to say that as much as I can, particularly since this is the second national election that we have without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And we see what happened in the first election, that they very arbitrarily and methodically, if we could put those in the same sentence, disenfranchised millions of Americans, people of color, immigrants in this community, in this country. They disenfranchised. They threw people off the voting rolls. They did all of those things, and we have been on a steady march trying to repair those things. And so our vote now is important to continue that march forward. It's important for us to continue making that fight for democracy take place. And so voting is the first step. But if you can't even complete the first step, then it's difficult for you to even go further on down the road. My professor, Ron Walters at Howard University, may he rest in peace, said he was the strategist behind the Jesse Jackson campaigns, both of them. He said, if you're not in the discussion, then what you say doesn't matter. And so it's important for us to get in the discussion. And voting and participating and engaging is how we get into the discussion. In fact, it's the real reason that I ran for mayor in 1994 right out of college, because I was determined to put my ideas on the table. Mm-hmm. And the only way I could put my ideas on the table was to get involved. You have up until October the 13th to register to vote. As was said, we need as many people to get out there as we possibly can. I want to thank Prudential Arena, the Devils, J.R. Smith, the NBA Players Association, for urging us and allowing us to use the Prudential Arena as a polling site. People can actually go there if you're confused. You can get your ballot in the mail. You can actually go there, get a provisional ballot, and vote right there at the Prudential Arena at the Devils Stadium. So I would encourage you and encourage everybody else to marshal as many people as you can in your family and outside your family to get them to the polls in November.
Thank you, Mayor Baraka. So I think it's time to bring the audience into this conversation. And we have a few questions, so keep them coming. Post your questions and we'll flag as many as we can. So the first question is for Ryan as a follow-up on just the issues of youth incarceration in New Jersey. So the question is, does New Jersey have any alternatives to incarceration programs in place for the juvenile justice system? I know that the Corrections Association in New York has done some of that work.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think part of the theme of the conversation here is there are some. I think the Newark Community Street Team is a shining example of one. The Youth Advocate Program is another. But the reality is there aren't enough, precisely because we invest so much on the incarceration side. And so I think, one of the things I really appreciate about the mayor is, and he didn't say it, but he got national attention for his investment of 5% of money away from the NPD into violence prevention strategies. And he called that an initial investment. And so I think for us to answer her question genuinely, we have to free up resources to provide additional resources. I just want to say really quickly, one story that sort of has stuck with me around investment also comes from New Jersey's history. So right after slavery, a former enslaved Black man started what became known as the Bordentown School for Colored Youth. Mm-hmm. It was an elite Black boarding school, publicly run, and it existed for about 80 years. And
my grandmother went there, had no idea.
Man, I didn't know that. I mean, that right there. It educated generations of Black folks who went on to do things like chair the engineering department at Vanderbilt University, or Shané's grandfather. I mean, it was an incredible school, and it reflected a deep investment from New Jersey because it was publicly run. And then in 1954, after the Brown decision, the school had a hard time integrating. It actually could only attract 2 white students. It turns out that there are 2 white kids incarcerated on the ground that still exists, the Bordentown School for Colored Youth across the street. So that today, what was once the pinnacle of Black excellence, the Bordentown School for Colored Youth, campus is still there. administrative building is still there. The gym is still there. The dorms are still there. But also there are 2 of New Jersey's 3 youth prisons on the same campus. And so it is literally the school to prison pipeline realized. And I lift that up because there was a time in the not too distant past where New Jersey made deep investments in incarcerating Black kids. And today, the big challenge for us is we make very deep investments on the back end in incarcerating kids. And so we don't have the kind of resources that we need to provide the kind of services, this continuum of care of which a Newark Community Street Team is a part, but we need more resources to support those programs more deeply. I know Aqueela would say amen to that. And part of what that requires, yes, is courageous political leadership, but we also need to affect policy change. So I put in the chat a tool you can use. Is called Phone to Action. It'll bring you to a bill called the New Jersey Youth Transformation Act. It does a number of things, including looking at the sort of policies and practices that drive our racial disparities, a 21-to-1, right, that piece. But also looks at the kinds of financial investments we need to make in communities on the front end and also on the back end. Last piece I'll say is, so the bill asks for $100 million every year to be invested in communities most impacted by youth incarceration. That number is drawn from New Jersey's investment in helping those ensnared in the opioid crisis around prevention, diversion, rehabilitation. So we want to summon the compassion afforded to those ensnared in the opioid crisis. 90% of those folks have been white in the last 10 years to our communities most impacted by youth incarceration.
Thank you, Ryan. And I think, yes, underscoring how do we get back to investing in human capital, which has been the way that we advance social mobility in this country. Another question from the audience, and, I think, the city of Newark has gotten some recognition for the work that we're collectively doing in really reframing police and community race relations and other strategies. So the question is, are other cities learning for the law enforcement changes Newark has made over the past years? And how can cities and states leading the way serve as models?
I'll let Aqueela should probably jump on that quick, and then I'll follow.
Okay, sounds good. Aqueela first.
Just this past week, the Newark Community Street Team hosted Patterson, Atlantic City, and a host of our local partners, the Health Department, the Newark Anti-Violence Coalition, Newark Street Academy, in a training around with the Professional Community Intervention Training Institute to export our model, to other cities across the state. We've also been instrumental in moving about $20 million from the state's Victims of Crime Act to a hospital-based violence intervention program funding. So 9 cities across the state has received that funding. And then NCST, we're instrumental in partnering with the HAVI, the Hospital Alliance for Violence Intervention, to provide technical assistance for those community-based agencies that are working with hospitals on the ground. So this work is being exported. We're currently working in 5 cities now. We constantly, are hosting folks from different cities, not only in the state, but from all across the country. I mean, just about last month, the mayor was speaking with the mayor of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, sharing with them some of the strategies that we did here in order to expand the work. And now Baton Rouge is getting ready to launch the Baton Rouge Community Street Team. And so this work is happening and flourishing across the state. Thanks so much to to the investment from Prudential and also from the vision from our mayor.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting. And I want to echo everything he said. But what's interesting is not too far before George Floyd in Minnesota, we were actually out there discussing these very concepts of how to have alternative response to violence and crime in the community, how to improve the relationship between police and community in Minnesota, in the same exact place
Yes.
where that happened at.
Oh,
And we had people from all over the country there that to prove the timeliness of what we were trying to impart upon people and say why this is important to be done and carried out clearly. And now I think people are beginning to take it more serious.
right.
And I don't want to and I don't want to make you believe that Newark embraced it immediately, because that's just not factual, right? It took us a minute to get to this place here in the city, and it takes other people a minute to get there themselves, to get the political will, the ecosystem together, to get people to understand it, to get community folks to buy into it. It takes a minute, and unfortunately, we're running out of time very rapidly. But I think all of these incidents have forced people to look at what's going on differently. And as Aqueela pointed out, there are many people coming, trying to figure this out.
Thank you, Mayor Baraka. So I'm going to combine two questions. The first one is really about allyship. And the question is, I'm a white woman living in the suburbs. What advice would you give me to be a part of the discussion? And I want you guys to weigh in on that, but I also want to broaden that to kind of what are the ways that anyone can get involved in supporting this work and supporting these efforts, everything from the Newark Community Street Team to some of the other initiatives that you're leading, Mayor Baraka, in the city of Newark, and Ryan, the campaigns that you're driving. But let's first start with this idea of allyship and the question about, what do we do and how do we engage folks who want to be allies and want to be engaged?
So I would say, one, fight for justice and equality. That's number one. On November the 3rd, cast your vote for the candidate who you believe is opposed to these things that are happening, and encourage your friends to do the same thing. What has always been interesting to me is that all these protests that are happening in these cities where these things are going on, a lot of these police officers are not from these communities. They're actually from the community, the suburban communities, where they learn this racist behavior and these attitudes and these ideas. And so we have to have the courage to fight these things in our communities where they are. The same ease that you have with coming to Newark to hold the banner and march up and down the street is the same ease you should have challenging the educational system, challenging the legislators, challenging the municipal government there to do what's right and teach people about equity and justice in your community. But also all of the state issues that we're fighting for in New Jersey, whether you support a civilian complaint review board, the issues that Ryan talked about in terms of youth prisons and diverting money from places that we're used to getting it and sending it to other communities. I just was going back and forth with somebody on the internet today, a young white lady from Newark who was saying that she felt discriminated against because we wanted to create a fund to equalize or shorten the wealth gap. So we have to begin to figure out, why does equality make us uncomfortable, right? Why does repairing wrong make us uncomfortable? If it makes you uncomfortable, then you have to check yourself, right? And you have to figure out how to deal with that. And if it doesn't, then you try to come into these communities and be a part of what we're doing. Because there's room, there's open space for you to be a part, either through philanthropic support, economic support, moral support, spiritual support, legislative support. We welcome anybody of all nationalities, of all communities, of all languages and colors who believe in humanity and feel that everybody should be treated equally. Because at the base of this violence is inequality. At the base of this violence is gross and severe inequality that has existed for centuries in this country. And what you're seeing is the outgrowth of pent-up trauma and abuse that is being is self-loathing and has been put on top of each other, which is what Du Bois said. The problem with the 20th century, and I would say the century we're in now, is the color line, is our ability of how we see ourselves. We see ourselves through the eyes of people that despise us, and that plays itself out in our communities. And we have to do our best to change that condition. And I would welcome anybody to come and help us continue this fight for democracy for all Americans.
Thank you, Mayor Baraka. Are there others who want to weigh in on just ways that folks can plug in and support these efforts?
So I would just, I mean, on the policy side, you know, we need a broad coalition of folks to push these issues. You know, if an issue is seen as a so-called Black issue, right, only, it has very limited reach. So to white allies, I often encourage, like, I definitely, and I'm not diminishing it. I mean, I appreciate the Black Lives Matter signs in yards. I think those are important symbols. But I think what we need, right, is the kind of allyship that stands with us to get to the structures that those symbols reflect. So we say Black Lives Matter because we know they're planted in a foundation that undermines that ideal. And so even with the Youth Justice Transformation Act, you know, that's a very concrete way that the person who asked the question, which I appreciated, can click that and get to their elected official wherever they live and ultimately get to the governor. And every time you see your elected officials, urge them to focus on policies that make Black Lives Matter really. You know, New Jersey, I'll shut up after this, but New Jersey recently made Juneteenth a holiday. Now, I'm from Denver. We had an annual Juneteenth celebration, Mayor Baraka. Actually, when I was a senior in high school, I was Mr. Juneteenth. That was a thing. Manual High, 1993, I was Mr. Juneteenth. I'm pretty familiar with what the holiday recognizes, right? But ultimately what Juneteenth is about, as folks know, it's about freedom.
Sure.
For how can you celebrate in New Jersey freedom when Black people here confront the worst racial disparities in America? And so I worry about the way we lift up symbols if we don't get to the underlying structural challenges that these symbols reflect. So yes, look, I'm all for the strawberry soda on Juneteenth, but I also want to be figuring out how, for example, Mayor Baraka, do we get that reparative justice task force bill through? If we're going to talk about freedom, we got to talk about the way that slavery and its enduring legacy constrains the thing that we're celebrating on Juneteenth as we enjoy the strawberry soda, Mayor Baraka. So I think I appreciate the allyship question, but it requires you to do uncomfortable things. Look, it's very uncomfortable, as much as I love it, to be Black at times in this country. Yeah. And very often allyship doesn't step into that discomfort. It watches it in the way in which we're uncomfortable, but we need folks to step into that uncomfortable space to make it less uncomfortable for all of us.
And I would say that we just have to expand our definition around how we see public safety. As I said, traditionally you say public safety and people say police. But the reality is that you can't have public safety without the public, right? And public safety is not just the absence of violence and crime. It's also the presence of well-being in the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey, right? And there's multiple ways in which we can do that, as both Ryan and the mayor said. You know, there's a bill in the state, AB 3309, which is about establishing the New Jersey Violence Intervention Program. In neighborhoods where violence has been prevalent, not because people are predisposed, it's because these neighborhoods have been neglected for hundreds of years. And we've allowed the trauma to ripple and to fester without infrastructure to support people healing, right? And so now that we have complementary strategies that are shovel ready, that are on the ground, they need investment. And so we need folks to weigh in on these conversations around policy. We need them to show up to the polls and vote when it's, you know, when it comes up, so that we could collectively work on reducing violence and crime so that it doesn't, you know, begin to spread out into some of the suburban communities. Because if you think that it'll just be locked here in our neighborhoods, you're sadly mistaken. And then also, just in terms of the violence that happens in suburban communities. I mean, homicide, suicide, they're opposite sides of the same coin. It's the sexual, physical, and psychological abuse that people suffer in their lives that just go totally unaddressed. And so we have to create more intentional spaces in communities for these dialogues to happen. And so, you know, yeah, it's time.
Thank you. And I think my takeaway is there's not just one way to get engaged and be involved. I think the panel talked about everything from voting to influencing policy to writing a check to engaging more deeply with these organizations. I think the key is just to make sure that those actions are authentic and create impact. You know, the nice words of solidarity, which I think we're all feeling right now, doesn't mean much if there's not action on the other side of that. So, you know, we are at 7 o'clock. I can't believe a whole hour has passed. I think we could have talked forever. I just want to just thank the panelists, Mayor Baraka, Ryan Haygood, Aqueela, Sherrills, for speaking with us today and really highlighting their work to address systemic inequity in the justice system in Newark, New Jersey, and the state of New Jersey. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us today, which is a mix of community partners and community members, but we have a lot of Prudential employees that I think through this virtual environment has gotten a lot more engaged on these issues. So I'm glad that folks joined us today. And lastly, we also just want to thank Audible, who has generously provided a download copy of Just Mercy for everyone who participated in the discussion today. So we'll send a link with instructions to be included in the email that you'll receive after this discussion. And lastly, just thank you, Daniel, and the team at Represent Justice, who put this together, and we'll follow up with everyone who's joined for the panel discussion with additional resources, additional ways to check in. And we'll also be sharing this conversation online on Facebook, on YouTube, for anyone who was not able to join us today. So thank you again. So good seeing you and connecting with you. Hopefully we'll be able to do so in person soon, but we really appreciate everyone's time and their participation in this important conversation.